Amid the bustling chaos of a crowded supermarket, an elderly man with a generous heart was deeply moved when he noticed a desperate mother with two small, hungry, and crying children. Without hesitation, he decided to pay for her groceries, believing it was just a simple act of kindness. However, 5 days later, an unexpected phone call left him completely shaken, revealing a truth he could never have imagined. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from. And if you believe in helping the vulnerable, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel for more. Eduardo was at the supermarket, his slow footsteps echoing through the brightly lit aisles. He always shopped early in the morning to avoid the crowds, but that day something unusual caught his eye. Near the fruit section, a young mother, Isabel, was struggling to calm her two small children while balancing a basket full of groceries. The boys, tears streaming down their faces, were crying uncontrollably, clearly tired and hungry. Eduardo watched from a distance, feeling a pang of compassion. He wasn't sure why, but the scene touched him deeply. Perhaps it was the exhaustion in the young woman's eyes or the muffled sound of the children's sobs that reminded him of a time when he and Clara had a life full of energy. Moved by something beyond himself, Eduardo decided to approach. "Excuse me, do you need any help?" he asked, his voice gentle. Isabel looked up, surprised, and forced a smile. "Oh, we're fine, just a little tired," she replied, brushing her hair back and trying to maintain her composure. The children continued to tug at her clothes, demanding attention. Eduardo glanced at her cart, noticing the carefully selected items, but he couldn't ignore the nervousness in her movements. "Sometimes it feels like the day starts before we're ready for it," Eduardo remarked, trying to ease the tension. "And kids, they have endless energy." Isabel laughed, but it was a restrained laugh, the kind from someone carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. She pushed her cart toward the checkout. Eduardo followed discreetly, keeping some distance but not losing sight of what was happening. When she reached the checkout, she began unloading the items from her basket. The children, now slightly calmer, clung to her, watching intently. The cashier started scanning the items and the total began to rise. Isabel fidgeted with her wallet anxiously. When the last item was scanned, the final amount flashed on the screen. She looked at the small pile of money in her hands and realized it wasn't enough. "I need to put some things back," she said, trying to decide what to remove. Before she could act, Eduardo quickly stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. "No, please let me take care of this," he said firmly but kindly. Isabel looked at him, shocked. "No, I can't accept this, sir," she began. "Of course you can," Eduardo smiled, opening his wallet and handing the money to the cashier. "Consider this a gift. We all have tough days." Tears welled up in Isabel's eyes, and she quickly wiped them away, feeling embarrassed. "I don't even know what to say." "Thank you." She glanced at her children, who were now looking at Eduardo with a mix of curiosity and relief. Eduardo waved at the children and smiled at Isabel. "No need to thank me. Sometimes small gestures can make a big difference." She nodded, visibly moved, while Eduardo finished paying. He picked up his groceries and said goodbye with a slight wave. Isabel stood there, holding her children, still processing what had just happened. On his way home, Eduardo couldn't stop thinking about the young mother and her children. Something about that interaction made him reflect on his own life, on the choices he had made. His house, empty since Clara had passed, seemed even quieter. 5 days later, Eduardo woke to the sound of the phone ringing on the small table next to the armchair where he had fallen asleep the night before. His eyes took a few seconds to adjust to the soft morning light streaming through the window. He rarely received phone calls. Struggling to get up, he picked up the receiver, expecting it to be a wrong number. "Hello?" he said, his voice hoarse, still groggy from sleep. "Mr. Eduardo?" The voice on the other end was soft, but it carried a sense of urgency that made him sit up straighter in his chair. "Yes, this is he." "Who's calling?" "It's Isabel, the woman you helped at the supermarket. Remember?" There was a hesitation in her voice, as if she was embarrassed to be calling. Eduardo smiled immediately, remembering the young mother and the two boys. He had thought about her several times since that day but had never expected to hear her voice again. "Of course I remember, Isabel. How are you? Are the children doing okay?" he asked, trying to sound calm. There was silence on the other end, followed by a heavy sigh. "I don't know where to begin. I just wanted to thank you again for what you did, but the truth is, things have gotten even more complicated since then." Her voice trembled slightly as if she was trying to hold back tears. Eduardo felt a tightness in his chest. He could imagine what kind of complications a single mother faced, especially with two small children. It didn't take a genius to know the world wasn't kind to people in her situation. "What happened?" he asked, keeping his tone calm. "We were evicted." I couldn't pay the rent. We're living in the car. I didn't know who else to turn to, and I don't even know why I'm telling you this. Eduardo closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of her situation hitting him hard. He knew that feeling of helplessness, though in a different way. The loss of Clara years ago had left him with a void he could never fill. But the thought of a mother and 2 children sleeping in a car affected him deeply. You did the right thing by calling, he replied, determined. And if I can help in any way, I will. I can't ask for more, Isabel said, almost in a whisper. You've already done so much. Eduardo stood up and began pacing the room, trying to think of a solution. He knew what he was about to say was impulsive, but he couldn't ignore Isabel's situation. Listen, I have a spare room here at my house. If you'd like, you and the kids can stay here until things get better. It's not much, but it's better than the car. There was a long silence. Eduardo imagined Isabel weighing her options, but he also knew that in her position she didn't have many. I don't know what to say, she finally said, her voice breaking. I can't accept something like that. I don't want to be a burden. A burden? Eduardo chuckled softly. You wouldn't be a burden, Isabel. Believe me, I've lived alone for a long time. It'd be nice to have some company around here. And the kids need a safe place to sleep. That alone makes it worth it. There were a few more seconds of silence before Isabel reluctantly agreed. Okay, I'll accept, but only until I can get back on my feet. I promise we won't stay long. Eduardo smiled to himself, though she couldn't see him. Stay as long as you need. All right. We'll come over later today then. Thank you so much, Mr. Eduardo. Isabel seemed on the verge of tears but held herself together. We'll come over later today. Eduardo hung up the phone and stood still for a moment, looking out the window. The sun was already lighting up the garden where he and Clara had spent so many mornings together. Now, that big quiet house would have new voices, new laughter, or maybe new cries. But somehow he felt like he was making the right decision. As the day went on and Eduardo prepared the house for his new guests, he felt both anxious and strangely at peace. The presence of Isabel and her children would bring life back into his world, something he hadn't realized he needed until that moment. He glanced once more at the portrait of Clara above the fireplace, as if hoping for some silent approval. I hope you understand, Clara, he thought. I'm just trying to do something good, like you always taught me. Isabel arrived at Eduardo's house in the late afternoon, carrying the few bags she'd managed to save before being evicted. Her children, Mateo and Lucas, were restless, but there was something in their eyes, maybe a subtle sense of relief, that Eduardo recognized. He remembered how, when he was younger, his home had always been a safe refuge for him, and now he wanted to offer the same to this little family. Come in, Eduardo said with a warm smile, holding the door open. Isabel smiled back, still a little hesitant. Mateo, the older one, held his mother's hand tightly, while Lucas, the younger one, looked around with wide, curious eyes. As they entered, Eduardo could see how exhausted they were. The physical and emotional toll of living in a car was evident on their faces. Thank you, Mr. Eduardo. I don't know how to thank you enough, Isabel said, her voice still low, as if afraid to disturb the delicate balance of the situation. I've already told you, no need for formalities, he smiled gently. Just call me Eduardo. And please make yourselves at home. This house has more than enough space. He showed them the room he had prepared. It was simple but cozy, with a large bed for Isabel and an extra mattress on the floor for the boys. Eduardo had placed a few flowers in a vase on the bedside table, trying to add a touch of comfort to the space. It's so much better than the car, Isabel remarked, looking around, clearly emotional. And safer too, Eduardo replied. Now you have a place to truly rest. The boys ran to the bed, laughing for the first time since they arrived. Isabel watched them with a tired but genuine smile, and Eduardo noticed how precious that small moment of joy was for her. If you need anything, just let me know, he said before turning to leave the room. Eduardo, Isabel called before he left. He stopped and looked at her. I really don't know how to thank you. It's so much more than I could have asked for. You don't have to thank me, Isabel. I'm happy I can help, Eduardo smiled, but there was a certain sadness in his eyes, as if he were remembering something or someone. Isabel noticed but didn't comment. She knew what it was like to carry a pain you couldn't put into words, and in that moment, though she didn't fully understand how, she felt that they shared something in common. That night, after the boys had fallen asleep, Isabel stepped out of the room and found Eduardo sitting in the garden, gazing at the starry sky. She hesitated for a moment but then approached him. Is everything all right? He asked without taking his eyes off the stars. Yes, I just thought I'd keep you company if you don't mind, she replied, sitting in the chair next to him. Eduardo smiled, appreciating the gesture. The garden, which he and Clara had tended for so many years, was at its most beautiful during this time of year. The flowers were in full bloom, and the scent of damp earth filled the air. Isabel admired the garden. It's beautiful, she said. Do you take care of all of this by yourself? Yes, ever since Clara passed, Eduardo said without bitterness, just with a quiet melancholy. She loved this garden. We'd spend hours out here. Now I take care of it for both of us. Isabel looked at him, feeling the weight of the loneliness he carried. She knew how hard it was to lose someone you love, and despite her own troubles, she felt a wave of compassion for Eduardo. It must be hard, she whispered. I'm sorry. Eduardo shook his head gently. Life is like that. It takes things from us, but it also gives us others. He looked at Isabel. Like you and your boys. Maybe I needed company more than I realized. Isabel smiled, but her expression soon turned serious. Eduardo, I need to tell you the truth about why we're in this situation. It's not just the eviction. She paused, gathering her courage. I'm running from my ex-husband, Victor. He's a dangerous man. Controlling. When I tried to leave the relationship, he made my life a living hell. That's why we lost the house. He made sure I had nowhere to go. Eduardo remained silent, absorbing her revelation. He had known there was more to Isabel's story, but he hadn't expected it to be something so dark. I'm so sorry, she said, ashamed. I don't want to put you in danger. If he finds out we're here. Hey, Eduardo interrupted her gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. You and the boys are safe here. I'll protect you. Victor won't find you. I promise. Isabel looked at him, surprised by the firmness in his voice. It was the first time in a long time that she felt truly protected. Thank you, she said sincerely, her eyes filling with tears. Eduardo nodded, and in that moment he knew his life was about to change completely. In the days that followed, Eduardo's house came alive with the presence of Isabel and her children. The sound of children's laughter filled the once silent space, and Eduardo found himself smiling alone whenever he heard the boys playing in the yard. He hadn't realized how much he missed that kind of liveliness until now. Isabel did her best to repay Eduardo's hospitality, helping in the kitchen, cleaning the house, and most importantly, tending to the garden that Eduardo and Clara had loved so much. She showed a special care for the plants, something Eduardo quickly noticed. You've got a knack for this, he remarked one morning, watching her as she planted new flowers in one of the beds. Isabel smiled, wiping the sweat from her forehead. My mother always said that plants can feel the love you put into them. I guess that's the one thing she taught me that really stayed with me. Eduardo stayed silent for a moment, observing her dedication. There was something profound in Isabel's movements, as if caring for the garden was her way of quieting the pains of the past. You tend to this garden like it's your own, he said softly. She looked at him, surprised, but then smiled, a mix of gratitude and sadness on her face. Maybe because, in a way, it feels like it is. She paused, looking at the newly planted flowers. I don't know how to explain it, but here with you and the boys I feel like I'm starting to create something real, something that can't be taken away from me. Eduardo nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. He felt the same. The loneliness that had accompanied him since Clara's death was slowly fading, replaced by a sense of purpose he thought he'd never feel again. But as the routine in Eduardo's house began to stabilize, he couldn't ignore the shadow that loomed over them. Victor, Isabel's ex-husband, with his threatening presence, was still a ghost in her life, and Eduardo knew that sooner or later, they would have to confront it. One evening, while Eduardo was sitting in the living room reading, Isabel joined him. The boys had already gone to bed, and the house was quiet, save for the soft sound of the wind outside. Eduardo, I've been thinking, Isabel began, sitting on the sofa across from him. About what? He closed his book and looked at her attentively. About Victor. I don't think we can stay here forever. I mean, he has resources. He could eventually find us. Eduardo sighed. He knew Isabel was right, but he also knew that she and the boys had nowhere else to go. The thought of Victor finding them there filled him with a sense of urgency. We'll find a solution, Isabel. I promised I'd protect you, and that's what I'm going to do, Eduardo said, determined. Maybe I can talk to a lawyer, see if there's anything we can do to legally keep him away from you. Isabel looked at him, surprised by the firmness of his words. You'd really do that for us? She asked, her eyes welling up with tears. Of course. I've never been good at standing by when I know I can do something, he said, smiling slightly. Isabel lowered her head, fighting back tears. She was used to handling everything on her own, and the idea that someone was willing to help her so selflessly was almost overwhelming. "I don't know how to thank you, Eduardo. You came into our lives when I had no hope left," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Eduardo smiled at her. "Sometimes life surprises us in ways we don't expect. I've been alone for so long and now, suddenly, you've brought life back into this house. I think I'm the one who should be thanking you." Isabel smiled back, but Eduardo could see that she was still worried. He knew words were comforting, but they needed more than that. They needed action. The next day, Eduardo went into town to meet with a lawyer who might be able to help with Isabel's case. Meanwhile, she stayed home taking care of the children and the garden. Eduardo knew that Isabel was constantly on edge, always expecting the worst, and he couldn't blame her. Victor was a real threat, and Eduardo had to make sure he couldn't get to them. When he returned home with some information from the lawyer, he found Isabel sitting on the porch, looking distant. "Any news?" she asked, not even turning to look at him. "Yes," Eduardo replied, approaching and sitting next to her. "The lawyer said we could try for a restraining order. It's not foolproof, but it would at least put a legal barrier between you and Victor." Isabel sighed, shaking her head. "I don't know. Victor always gets what he wants. He has friends everywhere." She looked at Eduardo, her expression grave. "I don't want you getting too involved in this. If he finds out we're here, he'll come after you too." Eduardo placed a reassuring hand on Isabel's shoulder. "I'm already involved, Isabel. And I won't let him hurt you or the boys." Isabel was silent for a few moments, absorbing his words. There was something in Eduardo's tone that made her feel a sense of security she hadn't felt in a long time. Though the fear of Victor still lingered, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance to escape his shadow. Life at Eduardo's house seemed to be settling into a rhythm. Isabel and the boys were adjusting, and the sense of safety grew stronger with each passing day. However, the threat of Victor never completely left Isabel's mind. Eduardo, for his part, was determined to keep them safe, but knew things were far from resolved. One night, after the boys had gone to bed, Eduardo was in the kitchen making tea when he heard a soft knock at the door. He glanced out the window but saw nothing. Another knock, this time louder. Eduardo's heart raced and he walked to the door on quiet steps. When he opened it, he was met with the last person he expected, Victor. The man, tall with a penetrating, menacing gaze, stood with the posture of someone who was in control. A cold chill ran down Eduardo's spine. "Can I help you?" Eduardo asked, trying to keep his voice steady but already knowing who he was. "I believe you can," Victor said with a cynical smile. "I'm looking for my wife, Isabel, and my children. I know they're here." Eduardo felt the weight of those words. Isabel had been right. Victor had found them. "I think you're mistaken," Eduardo replied, holding his gaze. "There's no one here who's running from anyone." Victor stepped forward, his face hardening. "Let's cut the games, old man. I know she's here, and if you think you can stop me from taking my family back, you're dead wrong." His voice was cold and sharp, making it clear he wasn't bluffing. Eduardo knew he couldn't let Victor intimidate him. Taking a deep breath, he straightened up. "Isabel isn't going anywhere with you, Victor. You've hurt her enough. She and the boys are safe here, and I won't allow you to destroy that." Victor smiled, but it was a humorless grin. "I thought you'd say that," he murmured, pulling an envelope from his jacket and handing it to Eduardo. "Consider this your formal notice. I have more resources than you can imagine. This isn't going to end well for you." Eduardo took the envelope, feeling the weight of Victor's threat in every word. He opened it with trembling hands, finding a court summons. Victor was trying to gain full custody of the children, claiming that Isabel was unfit to care for them. "I'll handle this in court," Eduardo said with more confidence than he felt. "Isabel has her rights, and I'm sure a judge will see who you really are." Victor laughed. "You're brave, I'll give you that. But you'll learn the hard way that people like me always get what we want. By the way, give my regards to Isabel. She knows she can't run from me." With those words, Victor turned and left, leaving Eduardo standing at the door, feeling powerless. He knew he had to act quickly. Isabel was in real danger, and Victor's threat was much more serious than he had imagined. Eduardo spent the night awake thinking about what he should do. The next day, before Isabel woke up, he went back into town to speak with the lawyer. The lawyer was honest with him. Victor, with all his resources, could very well get a favorable ruling in court, especially if he claimed Isabel was fleeing for no apparent reason. "But what can we do?" Eduardo asked, his frustration growing. "We can't let him win. Isabel fled because he was abusing her. Doesn't that count for anything?" The lawyer shook his head. "It depends on evidence, Eduardo. We need something concrete. Her account might not be enough without proof. If Victor has good lawyers, and it seems he does, he could use the law against her. Eduardo felt disheartened but refused to give up. He returned home, still without a clear solution but determined to protect Isabel and the children in any way he could. When he arrived, Isabel was already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. She smiled when she saw him, but Eduardo knew he would soon have to tell her about Victor's visit. "Isabel," he began as he sat down at the table, "Victor was here last night?" Isabel's smile vanished instantly. Her eyes widened in fear and she tightened her grip on the countertop. "What? He found us?" Her voice came out in a trembling whisper. "Yes," Eduardo confirmed with a lump in his throat. "He knows where you are. He brought a court summons. He's trying to take the kids back." Isabel covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking as she tried to hold back her tears. "I knew he wouldn't give up. He'll succeed, Eduardo. He always gets what he wants. I can't fight him. I have no money, no influence." Her voice was choked with despair. Eduardo went to her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. Hey, look at me. We're not going to let that happen, all right? We're going to fight. The lawyer told me we'll need evidence, something to show the court what kind of man he is. I know it seems impossible now, but I won't let you face this alone." Isabel looked at him, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know what to do, Eduardo. I just want my kids to be safe. They're all I have. And you're not going to lose them," Eduardo said firmly. "Not while I'm here." Isabel nodded, trying to compose herself. But even as Eduardo comforted her, he knew time was running out. Victor wasn't the type of man to give up easily, and the confrontation ahead would be the biggest challenge Eduardo had ever faced. Eduardo spent the rest of the day reflecting on the next step. He knew that the battle against Victor would be much more than a legal dispute. Victor was manipulative, powerful, and willing to use all his resources to regain control over Isabel and the children. But Eduardo couldn't allow that to happen. He needed a plan, something that would not only protect Isabel but also show the court and the world Victor's true character. That night, after the boys had gone to bed, Eduardo and Isabel sat in the living room. There was a tension in the air, as if they both knew things were about to change drastically. "We need to do something quickly," Isabel began, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Victor won't wait. He'll make everyone's life hell until he gets what he wants." "I know," Eduardo replied thoughtfully. "The lawyer said we need evidence, something that shows he's unfit to care for the boys. But that's difficult without witnesses or documents." Isabel bit her lip, clearly thinking of something. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Eduardo, I never told anyone this," she paused, nervous. "But Victor used to. He used to threaten me. Not just verbally. He has videos, recordings, things he made me do. I know he keeps all of it as a form of control." Eduardo furrowed his brow, feeling the weight of her revelation. He looked at Isabel, who was now clearly disturbed, but there was something more in her eyes, something he hadn't seen before, determination. "If we can get those recordings, we can prove what he's done," she suggested, her voice low. "He would never let this come to light because it could destroy his reputation. But if we have access to them, we can finally turn the tables." Eduardo stayed silent for a few moments, considering the implications of what Isabel was proposing. Invading Victor's privacy, accessing personal documents or recordings, all of that would be dangerous. However, he knew that without something like that, it would be nearly impossible to win this fight. "How can we do this?" Eduardo finally asked. Isabel took a deep breath. "I know where he keeps those things. When we were still together, he had a secret office in our house, a place where he stored everything he considered important." She paused, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't have the key, but I know he trusts an assistant named Diego. If we can get Diego to help us, maybe we can get those proofs?" Eduardo nodded, understanding the risk involved. He knew this wouldn't be easy. Victor had a network of people around him who would likely do anything to protect him. But looking at Isabel, he also knew they had no choice. It was now or never. "Let's go after it," Eduardo said firmly. "I'll find a way to talk to this Diego. We need that evidence and fast." Isabel looked at him, surprised by his determination. Eduardo was an elderly man, but the courage and resolve he showed were worthy of someone much younger. She smiled, a small and timid smile but full of hope. "Thank you, Eduardo. I don't know how I would have managed without you." Her voice was thick with emotion, and she squeezed his hand as if seeking support. "Don't worry," he replied, squeezing her hand back. "We'll get through this together." In the days that followed, Eduardo began to devise a plan to approach Diego. He discovered that Victor's assistant frequented a cafe downtown, and he knew this would be his opportunity. With the lawyer's help, Eduardo put together a strategy to convince Diego to cooperate. The idea was simple: use Victor's influence over him as a bargaining chip, offering a way out. The next afternoon, Eduardo went to the cafe, feeling a growing tension in his chest. He spotted Diego sitting at a corner table, absorbed in his phone. Eduardo took a deep breath before approaching. "Excuse me, you're Diego, right?" Eduardo said, positioning himself in front of him. Diego looked up, surprised by the approach. "Who's asking?" he replied, suspicious. "My name is Eduardo. I don't know if you know me, but I'm a friend of Isabel. We need to talk." Diego's eyes widened at the mention of Isabel, and he glanced around as if afraid of being seen talking to Eduardo. He hesitated for a moment but seemed to realize this was serious. "What do you want?" Diego asked, his voice low and cautious. Eduardo sat down at the table, leaning slightly forward. "We know that Victor has evidence of the threats he made against Isabel. Recordings, videos, documents. We need that evidence to protect Isabel and her children." Eduardo paused, observing Diego's reaction. "We know you have access to that material." Diego looked at Eduardo, visibly nervous. He knew what Eduardo was talking about, but he also understood how dangerous Victor was. His loyalty to his boss kept him trapped, but the fear of the situation was clear in his eyes. "I can't do that," Diego whispered, trying to avoid Eduardo's gaze. "If Victor finds out, I'll be finished." "Diego, listen," Eduardo said, his voice calm but firm. "If you continue to help Victor, you're perpetuating the abuse. Isabel is running for her life and her children's. You have the chance to do the right thing. And more, if you don't do anything, Victor won't hesitate to take you down with him when it's convenient." Diego bit his lip, struggling internally. Eduardo could see the conflict in his eyes. "I'll think about it," Diego finally said. "But I can't promise anything." Eduardo nodded, knowing that was the best he could get at that moment. "We don't have much time, Diego. Think fast." Eduardo stood up, leaving Diego in his dark thoughts, and exited the cafe. On his way home, he felt a mix of anxiety and hope. The fate of Isabel and the children was now in Diego's hands. In the days that followed the conversation with Diego, Eduardo felt increasingly apprehensive. He knew he was stirring a hornet's nest by trying to confront Victor, and he feared that time was against them. Each morning, he anxiously awaited a response from Diego, but the call he was hoping for never came. Isabel also sensed the growing tension, though she tried not to show it. She spent more time with the boys, trying to provide them with some sense of normalcy. Even so, the fear of being discovered by Victor was always present in her eyes. One night, after the children had gone to bed, Eduardo was in the living room reading a book when the phone rang. He jumped, feeling his heart race. It was late and few people would call at this hour. With a strange premonition, he answered. "Eduardo speaking." "It's Diego," said the voice on the other end in a whisper. "We need to meet." Eduardo felt a momentary relief but soon realized that Diego's tone was filled with urgency. "Where and when?" Eduardo asked. "Tomorrow at the same cafe as before. Come alone." "Please, I don't want to draw attention," Diego replied quickly before hanging up. Eduardo stood there for a few seconds holding the phone, feeling a mix of anxiety and hope. He knew this meeting would be crucial. If Diego decided to help them, it would be a decisive step toward protecting Isabel and the children. But if something went wrong, the risk could be even greater. The next morning, Eduardo headed to the cafe with a mind racing with thoughts. He entered the place and, just like last time, found Diego sitting in a corner, head down. Eduardo approached silently, feeling the weight of the moment. "Diego," Eduardo said, sitting down across from him. "Did you find anything?" Diego looked at him, clearly nervous, but there was a determination Eduardo hadn't seen before. He took a deep breath before speaking. "Yes. I managed to access Victor's office. It wasn't easy, but I was able to get some of the recordings and documents he used to blackmail Isabel. They're right here," he said, pushing a small folder across the counter toward Eduardo. Eduardo took the folder, feeling the physical and emotional weight of it in his hands. "Are these recordings enough to incriminate him?" Eduardo asked anxiously. "Yes. Victor recorded everything to keep control over Isabel. There are direct threats, insults, and some confessions of things he did to ruin her life. This should be enough to prove what kind of man he is," Diego replied, keeping his voice low. "But if he finds out it was me who took this from him, I'm finished," Diego added, his voice trembling. Eduardo looked at Diego, sensing the tension in the air. "You did the right thing, Diego. Isabel and the kids have a chance now thanks to you. We'll use this the right way, Eduardo said, trying to reassure him. I hope so, Diego murmured, visibly shaken. Just keep my name out of it. Victor can be relentless. Eduardo nodded, understanding Diego's fear. He knew that once Victor discovered he had lost control over Isabel, he wouldn't take it lightly. But in that moment, Eduardo felt a wave of renewed hope. He held the key to defeating Victor, and he knew he had to act quickly. I'll take this to the lawyer immediately, Eduardo said, getting up. And we'll do everything we can to keep you safe. Thank you, Diego. Diego nodded briefly but said nothing more. Eduardo left the cafe, holding the folder tightly, feeling that the fate of Isabel and the boys was finally changing. But he also knew that Victor wouldn't accept defeat easily. The final confrontation was approaching. Back at the house, Eduardo explained to Isabel what he had managed to obtain. When she saw the folder in his hands, her eyes filled with tears, a mix of relief and fear. I don't even know what to say, Isabel said, trembling as she took the folder. Can this really save us? Yes, Eduardo replied confidently. These recordings show the real Victor. We'll take them to the lawyer, and he can use this in court to ensure Victor no longer has power over you or the children. Isabel took a deep breath, holding the folder against her chest. You have no idea how much this means to me, Eduardo. For the first time, I feel like I might have a real chance to escape him. Eduardo placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. This isn't over. Victor will still try to fight, but now we're stronger. We'll move forward with the case, and he won't be able to control you anymore. Isabel nodded, trying to hold back tears. She knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but for the first time in years she felt like there was a light at the end of the tunnel. The next day, Eduardo and Isabel went to the lawyer with the evidence. The lawyer, surprised by the amount of material, immediately began preparing a strategy to use it in court. With the recordings and documents in hand, Isabel finally had the chance to face Victor on equal footing. However, Victor wouldn't be easy to defeat. Eduardo knew he would retaliate somehow, and time was against them. While the lawyer prepared the case, Isabel lived in a constant state of alert, always waiting for Victor's next move. Eduardo, on the other hand, was more determined than ever. He knew that protecting Isabel and the boys wasn't just about winning in court, it was a fight for their dignity and freedom, something Victor had taken from them for so long. And Eduardo was willing to fight to the end to ensure they had a real chance to start anew. The tension grew as the days passed. Eduardo knew Victor would soon discover that the recordings had been taken from his office, and the confrontation would be inevitable. Isabel tried to stay calm so as not to frighten the boys, but Eduardo could see the constant fear in her eyes. The lawyer was preparing the case quickly, but time felt like an enemy. Then everything changed. The next morning, Isabel was making breakfast when the phone rang. Eduardo, sitting at the table, felt his stomach drop at the sound. Something inside him told him that the call would bring bad news. He answered, and the voice on the other end confirmed his worst fears. Eduardo, it's the lawyer. Victor has filed an emergency custody request. He's claiming that Isabel is mentally unstable and is putting the children at risk. The court has scheduled a hearing for next week. Eduardo took a deep breath, trying to contain his anger. Victor had moved his pieces. Now the battle was unfolding in the legal arena, where his influence and money could make a huge difference. Are we prepared? Eduardo asked, gripping the phone tightly. We have the recordings and documents as our main defense, but Victor is bringing in top-notch lawyers. It's going to be a tough fight. Prepare for the worst, the lawyer replied in a grave tone. Eduardo thanked him and hung up. When he turned to Isabel, she was already standing by the table, looking at him with concern. What happened? She asked, trying to stay calm. Victor is trying to get full custody of the children. We have a week until the hearing, Eduardo said bluntly. Isabel covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes wide with fear. He's going to take my kids. I know he will. He has money, he has influence. What do I have? Her voice trembled, almost a whisper. Eduardo stood up, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. Isabel, we're not going to let that happen. We have the evidence. We have the truth on our side. And now we need to be strong, for you and the kids. Victor won't win. Not this time. Isabel nodded, still trying to process what was happening. She knew Victor was capable of anything to regain control, and the fear of losing them was almost paralyzing. But looking at Eduardo, she felt a spark of hope. He had done so much for her and the boys. Maybe there was a chance. In the following days, Eduardo's house was in a constant state of alert. Isabel lived in anxiety, waiting for Victor's next move, and he didn't disappoint. On Thursday morning, just 2 days before the hearing, Eduardo was in the garden when a black car pulled up in front of his house. The door opened and Victor stepped out, an arrogant smile on his face. Eduardo slowly approached the entrance, his mind already preparing for the confrontation. Victor looked around as if he were on familiar ground. "Eduardo," he said in an almost friendly tone, "good to see you. I came to collect what's mine." Eduardo felt a wave of anger surge through him. He knew Victor was there to intimidate, to show that he still had control. "Isabel and the children are not your property, Victor," Eduardo replied, keeping his voice steady. "They're safe here and you're not taking them." Victor stepped closer, the smile fading from his face. "I'm not here to play. I know what you and that traitor did. I know you took my recordings. But it doesn't matter. Next week in court I'll make sure she never sees those boys again. And you, well, you made a terrible choice getting involved in this." Eduardo glared at him, the tension in the air intensifying. He knew Victor was partly bluffing, trying to destabilize them before the hearing. "You don't have control anymore, Victor. The evidence we have shows who you really are." "Isabel isn't alone this time," Eduardo said, surprising even himself with his confidence. Victor laughed, but it was a humorless laugh, a laugh of disdain. "I always have control, Eduardo. And in court, where it all comes down to who can pay more, you'll see what I mean." He stepped closer, getting face to face with Eduardo. "Don't underestimate what I'm capable of." Before Eduardo could respond, Isabel appeared at the door. Her eyes widened at the sight of Victor, and she instinctively took a step back. Victor saw her and smiled. "Ah, Isabel. Hiding here with this old man. You know this won't last, right? On Monday you're going back home and the boys are coming with me. You've lost." Isabel stood still for a moment, but something inside her ignited. Eduardo noticed the spark in her eyes, as if something had finally changed. "No, Victor. You've lost," she said with a firmness Eduardo hadn't seen before. "For the first time, you no longer have control over me. And you'll see that in court." Victor looked at her, surprised by her reaction, but soon his face hardened. "We'll see," he murmured before turning and heading back to his car. "See you on Monday. Enjoy your time with the kids while you can." Eduardo and Isabel stood in silence as Victor's car drove away. The weight of the threat still hung over them, but something felt different now. Isabel no longer seemed like the frightened woman she had been before. She was determined to fight. Eduardo looked at her, admiring her strength. "You were amazing, Isabel," he said, offering an encouraging smile. Isabel took a deep breath, trying to control the adrenaline coursing through her body. "I won't let him intimidate me anymore. I won't let Victor take my children, Eduardo. I'm ready to fight now," she declared with determination. On the morning of the hearing, the atmosphere was charged with tension. Eduardo felt the weight of responsibility as he donned his suit. Isabel, calmer than in previous days, was getting ready alongside the boys. Mateo and Lucas didn't know what was happening, but they could sense the anxiety in the air. They would be staying with a friend of Eduardo's during the hearing, away from the legal turmoil about to unfold. Isabel kissed each of the boys before they left the house. "I'll be back before you know it," she said, trying to smile though her voice betrayed her nervousness. "Behave okay?" "We will, Mommy," Mateo replied, holding his younger brother's hand. Eduardo watched the scene with a heavy heart. He knew that for Isabel, this was the most important battle of her life. Victor was determined to take them away from her, and Eduardo feared what might happen if they lost. But as always, he maintained his calm exterior, knowing he needed to be a pillar of strength for Isabel. Upon arriving at the courthouse, the lawyer met them at the entrance, a serious expression on his face. "Are you ready?" he asked, giving Eduardo a firm handshake. "Ready enough," Eduardo replied, trying to mask his concern. "The judge is known for being fair, but Victor has a heavyweight legal team. It won't be easy, but with the evidence we have, we stand a real chance," the lawyer said, glancing briefly at Isabel. She nodded, her eyes focused. Victor was about to face the woman he never expected to see like this, strong, confident, and ready to fight. As they entered the courtroom, Victor was already there with his lawyers. He shot a cold glance at Isabel, but she ignored him, walking with determination to the opposite side of the room. Eduardo noticed the tension in the air, as if every movement was a preparation for an impending battle. The judge entered, and the hearing began. Victor's allegations were clear. He accused Isabel of being mentally unstable and unfit to care for their children. His lawyers presented a narrative full of exaggerations, trying to paint a picture of neglect on Isabel's part. With each word spoken against her, Eduardo felt his anger rising inside him, but he knew he needed to keep control. When it was time for Isabel to defend herself, the lawyer presented the recordings and documents that Diego had obtained. The evidence was compelling. The recordings showed Victor threatening Isabel, manipulating her, and admitting on more than one occasion that he had intentionally made her life difficult. As the audio played in the courtroom, Eduardo watched Victor's expression change. The control he had always displayed was crumbling. This evidence clearly demonstrates Victor's abusive and manipulative character, Isabel's lawyer said, looking directly at the judge. And it proves that he is unfit to have custody of these children. Isabel has been a victim of years of psychological abuse and just wants to protect her children from this cycle of control and fear. The judge, visibly impacted by the evidence, paused, observing Victor, who now appeared restless. "Mr. Victor," the judge began in a stern voice, "the recordings are incredibly clear. Your actions not only undermine your wife's emotional stability but also show a total disregard for the well-being of your children. I have serious doubts about your ability to care for these children appropriately." Victor clenched his fist, trying to remain calm as his lawyer stood up to rebut. But there wasn't much to say. The evidence was undeniable. Even with all of Victor's power and influence, he had been exposed. The hearing dragged on for hours, with every detail being scrutinized. Eduardo stayed by Isabel's side the entire time, whispering words of encouragement when she looked like she might crumble. But her strength surprised everyone, including herself. For the first time, Isabel felt that she wasn't fighting alone. She had Eduardo, the lawyer, and more importantly, the truth on her side. Finally, the judge called for a recess to deliberate. The silence in the room was suffocating as everyone waited. Isabel felt her hands trembling, but Eduardo held them firmly. "It's going to be okay," he said, looking into her eyes. "We've done what we could. Now we just have to trust." She nodded, trying to calm herself. She knew Eduardo was right, but the fear of losing her children was still overwhelming. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and waited. When the judge returned, the room fell silent once more. He looked from one side of the room to the other before beginning to speak. "After reviewing the evidence and hearing the testimonies, it is clear to me that Mr. Victor is not fit to have sole custody of his children," the judge began, causing a sigh of relief to pass through the room. "Miss Isabel has demonstrated, even amidst extremely challenging circumstances, that she has the ability and desire to protect and care for her children. Therefore, I am granting her full custody, with a restraining order against Mr. Victor to prevent him from approaching or interfering in the lives of his ex-wife and children." Isabel covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming freely down her face. Eduardo felt a deep sense of relief, as if the weight he had been carrying for weeks had finally been lifted from his shoulders. Victor, furious, stood up abruptly. "This isn't over," he shouted, his voice echoing in the room. "I will appeal. You think you've won, but this is just the beginning." The judge looked at him with disdain. "Mr. Victor, I advise you to be careful with your words. If you continue this behavior, I may very well order a deeper investigation into your actions." Victor clenched his fists, but he knew he had lost. At that moment, Eduardo and Isabel stood up together, ignoring Victor's threats. As they left the courtroom, Isabel paused for a moment, breathing in the fresh air as if she were free for the first time in years. She looked at Eduardo, her eyes still filled with tears. I don't even know how to thank you. You saved us," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. Eduardo smiled softly. "I didn't do this alone, Isabel. You were stronger than any of us could have imagined. Now you are free." Isabel hugged Eduardo, and for the first time in a long while, she felt she could begin to live without fear. Days after the hearing, life in Eduardo's house began to find a new rhythm. The court's decision brought a peace that Isabel hadn't felt in ages. Victor, with his anger and influence, had been forced to step back, and Isabel could finally begin to rebuild her life without the weight of his control. The boys, Mateo and Lucas, played in the garden, running among the flowers that Eduardo and Isabel had planted together. The sound of their laughter filled the air, and for a brief moment, it seemed the world was harmonious again. Isabel watched them from the porch, her heart finally lighter. "They're happier than ever," Eduardo said, coming out of the house with 2 cups of coffee in hand. He handed one to Isabel and sat down beside her on the porch. "Yes, they seem to be," she replied, smiling as she watched her children. "I never thought I'd reach this point. For so long I felt trapped, with no way out." Eduardo took a sip of coffee, reflecting on everything they had been through together. From the moment he saw Isabel at the supermarket, desperate with her children, until now. So much had changed. He had changed too. The loneliness he felt since Clara's passing had been replaced by a new mission, a new purpose. You were incredibly brave, Isabel. Eduardo looked at her with a genuine smile. No matter what Victor did, you stood firm. You protected your children, and for that, you have everything you need to move forward. Isabel looked at Eduardo, her heart full of gratitude. He not only provided a safe place for her and the boys but had also become a father figure she never expected to find. Eduardo's strength and compassion were the foundation that kept her standing in the darkest moments. I don't know how to express how grateful I am for everything you've done for us, Isabel said, her voice thick with emotion. You didn't have to do any of this, but you saved us. I don't know how to thank you. Eduardo smiled, shaking his head. You don't need to thank me. Sometimes life puts us in situations that allow us to help others. It's been a gift to have you here. You've brought light back to this house. Isabel smiled, moved, and for a moment they both sat in silence, watching the boys run among the flowers. It was a scene of tranquility, a total contrast to the previous months filled with fear and uncertainty. Now there was a sense of peace, a feeling that the worst was behind them. In the weeks that followed, Isabel began to truly rebuild her life. With Eduardo's help, she found a job at a small flower shop in town, a job that perfectly matched her love for plants. She and the boys continued to live in Eduardo's house, which had become more than just a temporary shelter. It had turned into a real home. The boys also thrived in this environment. Mateo, the oldest, began to excel in school, and Lucas, who had been more timid, started making friends and feeling more secure. The marks of the trauma left by Victor slowly began to fade. One afternoon, while Eduardo and Isabel were working in the garden, Lucas approached, holding something in his hands. Look, Grandpa Eduardo, Lucas said, showing a small flower he had picked. I planted this here. Eduardo looked at the boy, his heart warmed by the title of Grandpa that Lucas had naturally started using. He smiled and carefully took the flower. You did a wonderful job, Lucas. This flower is as beautiful as the ones your mom takes care of, Eduardo said. Lucas beamed with pride before running off to play again with his brother. Isabel watched the scene, feeling a deep peace in her heart. Eduardo had become part of her family, someone she never expected to find but now couldn't imagine life without. He adores you, you know, Isabel said, laughing softly. I think I've never seen Lucas so attached to anyone like this. Eduardo smiled, watching the boy run around the garden. And I love them. Those boys brought something into my life that I didn't know I needed. He paused, reflecting on what he was about to say. Since Clara passed, I thought I was doomed to live alone with my memories. But then you all came along and reminded me that life goes on. There's always something new to care for, to love. Isabel looked at Eduardo, her eyes filled with gratitude. We needed you too, Eduardo. More than you can imagine. As time went on, Eduardo's house became a true sanctuary for Isabel and the boys. Victor never tried to contact them again. The restraining order, along with the court ruling, ensured he stayed away. Isabel knew she would still have to deal with some wounds from the past, but now she had Eduardo's support and a network of people who cared for her and her children. Eduardo, for his part, found a new reason to live. His garden, which had once been merely a way to keep Clara's memory alive, now thrived with the help of Isabel and the boys. Each new plant, each new flower, was a symbol of renewal, of a fresh start. And so, in the serenity of that little garden, life moved forward, filled with hope and new possibilities. Eduardo, Isabel, Mateo, and Lucas formed an unlikely but deeply connected family, showing that even in the most challenging circumstances, love and kindness can take root and blossom where least expected.